In this video we're going to have a look at evolution and the fossil record. Now just to clear up a couple of misconceptions before we start, evolution doesn't mean getting better than something else, it just means changing. Evolution just means change. A species that changes over time has been said to evolve. Okay, again, getting a few of the keywords out of the way. Natural selection is where nature selects certain individuals to survive. They will be selected because they have characteristics that make them better adapted to their environment or lifestyle. These characteristics are caused by their genes in the DNA in their genes, and the changes in the genes is caused by mutations. So those individuals that survive and reproduce will pass these genes on to the next generation so they can be expressed again. This, over a very, very long period of time, will cause a species to change or evolve. Once again, because I feel it's important to emphasize it, evolution just means a change over time. Natural selection drives evolution and will lead to that change being so that the organisms are better adapted to where they're found. Okay, so we need to provide some proof of evolution. Now this can be a little tricky because we're talking about things that happened millions of years in the past, but we do have some clues and some evidence to go on. Our first kind of stepping stone for evidence is the fossils that we can find. The fossils are preserved remains of dead animals or plants. They could be the remains themselves or imprints that they made, and together we call all the fossils that we know about the fossil record. There are four ways that fossils can be formed. Firstly, the hard parts of an animal, like claws, teeth or bones, can sometimes escape the microorganisms that would rot them out. Sometimes minerals will seep in to replace this bone over thousands upon millions of years. Also, the organisms can leave prints behind, like footprints or prints from plants. And finally, in very particular circumstances, some dead organisms won't decay. For instance, if they get trapped in tar pits or in ice, where microorganisms can't get at them to decay them, they can be preserved. I don't know what this guy's if he's looking for a pulse, he's arrived a bit too late. Now the problem is the fossil record can be incomplete and we can often misunderstand it, mainly because the conditions for fossils to be formed are very, very rare. It's very unlikely that fossils have been formed from any particular animal. So the odds are that if you find a fossil, it's going to be from something that there was a lot of, because statistically it'd be more likely to be fossilized. For example, to show how it can be misunderstood, this is the bones of a human rearranged into kind of a shrimp man looking thing there. Here's another one where he's kind of got some sort of wizard hat on, but it's actually a pelvis, and hands coming out of it. Oh, well, let's not talk about that. But again, they could be misunderstood, and there were in fact travelling freak shows in the Victorian era who'd go around with fake fossils that they found. Now nowadays we've got ways to kind of discover a lot of these hoaxes, but back in the day it caused a lot of problem with figuring out evolutionary relationships. Okay, further evidence we can use to kind of verify that a fossil is, accurate and not just made up is we can look at the rock that the fossil was found in. These kind of rocks usually occur in strata or in layers, where the deeper down you go, the older the fossil is. So you can actually date the fossil, and I don't mean ask it out on a date. You can find out what date it's from by looking at what part of the rock column it's found in. Do you remember how I mentioned that the change that will drive natural selection comes down to a mutation in your DNA? If you didn't get that bit, just watch the start of X-Men. Patrick Stewart explained it much cooler. Mutation drives the change, which will then in turn drive natural selection. But the mutation rate happens at a pretty constant speed that we know about. So if we find a fossil and we manage to get some DNA from it, you can look at the DNA now, compare it with the DNA of a living descendant of it, and see just how much it's changed. And because it changes at a certain rate, we can date that again. The final kind of way we can find a time period for fossils is through radiocarbon dating. That's not where a radio falls in love with a piece of carbon. It's actually where, carbon comes in two kind of flavors and two isotopes. There's a few, but anyway, we're looking at two. Carbon-14 and carbon-12. Carbon-14 will degrade to become carbon-12 over a set period of time. So if you know how much carbon you started with, and you figure out how much has changed into carbon-12, you can, do you know what? Ask your chemistry teacher. For now, radiocarbon dating, how quickly C14 degrades to C12. So now that we can put not a precise date, now that we can put a rough date on when fossils are found, we can kind of order them into the ones that are closest to now, to going back in time. In this diagram here, for instance, towards the bottom is 60 million years ago, and as you go up towards the horse you're all familiar with at the top, you're kind of coming forward in time. Now you might be shown a diagram like this and be asked to explain how a species has evolved over time. And you just look at the physical information they give you. So if you look here, the horses are generally getting bigger as they go. You can see that physically from the diagram and also from the height on the right hand bit. But also if you look at the bone structure, they start off with a hand quite like ours with separate fingers. But these fingers kind of merge into what becomes the hoof as we know it now. So again, right there you can have a look at the fossil record and see just exactly how a species has changed or evolved over time. Getting a bit more complex now, but using the same evidence of exactly when fossils were found, we can start to determine the relationships between species. And we find that all land animals that exist now will have, if you go far enough back in time, and we're talking millions of years, they'll have one common ancestor that gave rise to them all. So if you start going back in time from now, you'll see that we share common ancestors with organisms that are quite closely related to us. For example here, the chimpanzee is a common example. If you go back just a mere 3 million years, you'll find the common ancestor between humans and chimps. You just do that by kind of tracing a line back until they meet. Here's a similar diagram showing how what we now know as the modern elephant evolved. If you look very far to the left, you've got the distant ancestors, and as you get closer towards the present day, going towards the right of the diagram, you see the more closely related branches of the elephant family. Now if you look, see how some of the elephants don't seem to make it to the present day, where they're not in, we can't find them today. That's because they've gone extinct. You can't find them anymore, they're all gone. To put things in perspective, here's a diagram that tries to show every living thing that exists. Now, of course, there's some that we haven't discovered. There's many that we haven't discovered. But even the ones that we have, if you can see, there's a mind-boggling amount of different species. And this, in each individual branch here, isn't a species, it's a whole group of species. There are millions, literally millions of species of organism on the planet. And just to put it in perspective, do you see that little arrow underneath animals to the bottom left, just a little bit to the left around animals, with "you are here" written on it? Well, that's us. So extinction is when a species dies out and you can't find any more of it. There's a few natural causes for extinction. A new disease can very quickly wipe out a population, just like when we discovered dodos, we brought a whole load of diseases with us that they weren't used to, carried by our rats and dogs, and wiped out the dodos very, very quickly. New predators can very quickly decimate a population and drive them to extinction, in particular if the predators are from a different area, or if they've evolved just a new mechanism that the prey can't adapt to quickly enough, they can wipe them out. And finally, competition can drive a species to extinction. The red squirrel in Britain is pretty close to extinction from competition from the grey squirrel that was introduced in the 1800s. Okay. While there's a certain kind of natural background level extinction caused by these factors we just discussed, there's also, if you look at the fossil record, certain mass extinctions. When the extinction rate shoots up where the vast majority of species are wiped out by certain events. These events are known as bottleneck events. Bottleneck because if you try pouring everything through a bottle, it gets held up. So if you look on the left hand side, you've got an original population with little red, yellow, green, blue balls, but in a bottleneck situation where most of them get wiped out, only a few survive, and a lot of the diversity, a lot of the difference that you started with is lost. If you look at the little beaker in the middle there's no more little red balls. None of them made it through by pure chance, which means over time when that population recovers, those red ones are wiped out, they become extinct. There are several possible causes for these mass extinctions. Now, of course, no one was around exactly to document them, but we can look at radiocarbon dating, and we can look at fossils. We have ways to figure it out, but for the most part, these will have to remain theories. One cause of mass extinction are ice ages, when the temperature of the Earth plummets. Also, meteor strikes can cause a mass extinction, just like the one that we think killed off the dinosaurs. Now, again, no one was around at the time who could write about it, so we're just going to have to leave it as a theory for now. Finally, we're going to have a look at how new species can come to be, and in particular we're going to have a look at how geographic isolation can cause new species to develop. Now, Charles Darwin famously noticed this when he went to the Galapagos Islands, and he noticed that species of finch from neighbouring islands would be similar to each other, but they'd be actually quite different at the same time. Each one will have adapted to the new area that it's found on. For example, imagine that these two islands were once linked by a land bridge before they were flooded, and you started off with a common ancestor. Later on, when that bridge went away and the two populations were isolated, each one would adapt to the conditions on its island and will change. For example, here's a diagram showing the same, different scenario where you've got a species and suddenly there's a river that divides it, and over time the conditions on one side of the river bank might be different from conditions on the other, and these species will change, again caused by natural selection. If they're better adapted, they'll survive and pass on their genes. If the species changes enough, they won't be able to breed anymore, even if you were to reintroduce them to where they came from. They've now become a new species. If a species can only be found in one area, it's said to be endemic to that area.